BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. BNSF, the engine that connects us. Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world. From the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. Perhaps the biggest issue debated at the State Capitol was around something we can all relate to. What does it mean to be an employee? We're joined by Dan Walters of CalMatters and John Myers of the LA Times. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you.
So John, is this issue a response to the widening income gap between those who have and those who don't?
I think broadly speaking, it's a response to the changing nature of work in the 21st century. I think as we have seen some industries flourish that use independent contractors, whether it's ride sharing or trucking or other industries, there have been these pushbacks that there aren't enough protections of those people in those jobs. They don't have enough benefits. And when they don't have benefits, the argument is they come back to the government system to use benefits there. And so I think it's balled all together in there. And what we ended up with, I think, was a victory for one side, organized labor, but I don't think the conversation ends there.
Yeah, let me ask you that, Dan, about organized labor. I mean, what does this mean for their political clout, for unions?
Well, it shows they have political clout in the current legislature. It also implies something else about organizing. They've been losing members in California. Their membership's been declining steadily for the last...
On a percentage basis?
No, in absolute numbers.
Absolute terms as well.
Absolute numbers. And they've probably maxed out on public employees. They're looking to organize private sector employees, and they need more private sector employees if they're going to be able to organize.
Well, you know,
them.
California lost all the manufacturing in Southern California, so that was a big hit for them.
There've been a number, and they've never been able to crack Silicon Valley. And so they're looking for opportunities, and this may be an opportunity. I also pointed out that the background of this thing is unusual. It was a Supreme Court decision that set this whole thing in motion. A company down in San Diego, a delivery company, had employed drivers and then changed them from employees over to contractors, opening the door then for a lawsuit that ultimately resulted in this ABC test that the legislature now puts in law, except that it's offered some exceptions, and there's going to be other people pushing for more exceptions, and there's also going to be probably a ballot fight over the whole thing. So we've not seen the last of this at all.
What about union political power as a result of this?
I certainly think they come out ahead. I mean, they had a big win. I don't think you could say that organized labor has lost any of its real political muscle in Sacramento, even with a lot of changes from sizes to rules about their political money. I think the question is, what do they do with it now? Is it about organization, or is it about these other issues they care about, including wages, minimum wages, benefits? There are a lot of places here that I think organized labor may seek to use this victory on AB 5 to move an agenda forward.
It seemed like labor kind of took it on the chin with Janus' decision by the Supreme Court for public sector workers, and now
hasn't had much impact, at least in terms of muscle right now.
Yeah, but they were very concerned about that initially. So, John, what about the impact on the governor's Future of Work Commission? He's got this commission out there. What impact is this going to have?
I don't know. I don't want to be a skeptic, but if I was going to be a skeptic, I mean, you know, blue ribbon commissions are a dime a dozen, right? I mean, but there are a lot of people on this, and I think it does tee up an issue nicely, which I said at the top of this conversation, which is what is the nature of work in the 21st century, how work is changing, how we use it, automation issues, benefits and rights. I think it's a good conversation. I don't know what the end product of that commission is going to be or when, but it certainly gives them something to start off with.
And you also have to remember that California is not an island, although we act like it sometimes. So whatever happens here on work rules and gig economy and everything will reverberate in other places. And California can't make itself so uncompetitive with these other places that we start facing the economic consequences.
You know, it's interesting. You remind me of law school. You know, we used to study with majority of rule, what the majority of states are doing, what the minority of states are doing. I went to University of Wisconsin, and then we studied what's California doing. So this is, you know, I won't say how many, long time ago. So it's been that way for a while.
Yeah, there's actually a similar push on gig workers going on in New York right now.
Right. So there you go. So what about the presidential election, John? What do you think this issue is going to resonate in the presidential election?
I think it's already started to trickle into that conversation. You had a handful of Democratic presidential candidates who backed AB 5. I think the first one was Elizabeth Warren, senator from Massachusetts, with an op-ed in a newspaper. I think you're going to hear that conversation. I think it plays into that larger national narrative, again, about the workplace and workplace rights. And then to Dan's point earlier, this is not over, because 3 of the companies that lost out here, Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash, the gig sharing economy, have put $90 million into a ballot measure campaign that they say they will try to take this to the voters next year to get their own rights and their own exclusion here. We'll see what they do and how they do it, but they have put up the money.
Yeah.
There might be 2 ballot measures, one to negate the law, a referendum, and another one to put an alternative law on the books so that the Supreme Court is blocked out from doing it again. Yeah. So if they just negate the law, the Supreme Court decision stands. So it doesn't really accomplish it. They have to get an alternative law in the books. So we may have 2 ballot measures, not just one.
Okay. Well, up next, what about the big housing issue? That's been a major issue with the state capitol. That conversation in a moment. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. So what about the politics of housing? We're talking with John Myers of the LA Times and Dan Walters of CalMatters. So Dan, you referred to the governor and legislature's action on housing as quote unquote just a half a loaf, unquote.
Or maybe less than a half a loaf, the truth be out. Yes, they did a rent control bill, a kind of a semi-rent control bill, but very little was done to actually spur the construction of new housing, even though the governor had promised during his campaign that he was going to build 3.5 million units of housing by 2025, which had been 500,000 a year. We're building only maybe 100,000 a year now. He'd be lucky to have 500,000 in by 2025. Obviously,
but that's the pace he has to do. He has to do half
a million a year, which is
and he's under 100,000. He's 20% of the target.
2.5 times as much as we've ever built. So it was kind of off the wall to begin with. But nevertheless, the legislative session did not do anything that will truly break the logjam on housing and get the kind of multi-billion-dollar investment in housing that's needed to catch up, even at 200,000 a year, which is a more realistic sort of number.
So John, half a loaf?
I mean, I see that because I think Dan's exactly right. When you look at actual supply of housing, we didn't put anything really substantive in that. I mean, we've got bills to say you can build a casita, right, a granny flat in your backyard, but that's not really bringing the housing issue down. The rent issue is interesting, though. I do want to just highlight it just for a moment. I mean, this bill, the governor, supported and said he would sign into law. It imposes new limits on the growth of rent in parts of California that don't have them. It doesn't supersede things like in Los Angeles and San Francisco. It adds with those. I think it's twofold. One, it's interesting to see whether it'll change actually the dynamic of how much people are paying in rent. And the second one is it has a political element on it. Will it possibly stop the effort for another full-scale rent control ballot measure in 2020? The backers of that say, no, it's not. But I think that's part of what was going on.
Yeah, I think part of the negotiations is to tell the Democratic legislators, hey, don't get on board with that proposition.
Yeah, this might work.
So Dan, let me ask you about this. What are your thoughts about some of the major housing bills that failed, like SB 50 that talked about transit-oriented development? Opponents argued that was coming at the expense of local control.
Yeah, and that's why it died. The local communities don't like losing their control over land use. It's one of the most important powers that they have. It's also very important to residents of communities to be able to control the development in their own neighborhoods. In fact, there's a candidate for running for mayor of San Diego now on the basis of save our neighborhoods, keep the Sacramento politicians from forcing us to take high density, low-cost housing in your neighborhoods if you don't want it. Right. And so it's a very powerful thing. There's palpable opposition, particularly in some of the more affluent neighborhoods and affluent cities. And the bill just died without fingerprints. It just didn't go anywhere. It just died. And
because it seemed to have some momentum for a while.
It had momentum, and the governor was kind of saying, yeah, we need something like that. But he didn't lift a finger to do anything about it.
He didn't back it, which I think was a huge issue for it. And at the end of the day, I mean, these were lawmakers that were concerned about it from the suburbs. I mean, this really was a victory of the suburbs across California against some of the more urban areas that wanted those suburbs to have to build more housing inside their areas.
But is this just an ongoing part of the ongoing battle between the state and local governments about housing decisions?
I think it's a battle, the ongoing battle between state and local governments over all kinds of things. But I mean, what's interesting is that when you look at some of the top line polling, we did a poll, Los Angeles Times UC Berkeley poll, where we asked, do you want locals or state to have more power here? there was a strong notion that the state should have more control. But when you get into the details, to Dan's point about what it means in neighborhoods, what it looks like in those communities, the not in my backyard mentality, that's where it gets to be really tough.
Yeah, that's for sure. That the NIMBY thing is pretty important. So, John, let me ask you this. Housing crisis isn't going away. Indeed, it's probably only going to get worse over time. I mean, citing Dan's statistics.
You're optimistic, I see.
You're right. Realistic, I would argue.
Right.
The political pressures are going to intensify. So what housing ideas do you see coming back, either as a bill next year or as a proposition on the November 2020 ballot?
Ballot's hard to know. I mean, we're kind of getting short on time for people to actually get a ballot measure submitted to get it in the 2020 cycle, given the deadlines there. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised to see SB 50, this issue again about what is built in suburbs and trying to increase density in some areas and spread this out, and also build more housing in transit-oriented areas. I wouldn't be surprised to see that come back. I think the author, State Senator Scott Wiener of San Francisco, said he wants to come back on that.
He's been persistent about that.
And the governor said he supported the idea. So I think, back to our point a moment ago about the governor not lifting much of a finger to help this. This is like a put up or shut up moment for Gavin Newsom, perhaps, to get involved next year.
Yes, he's the one who said he wanted to build 500,000 units a year. After all, there is one bill that did reach.
That's a lot of granny flats, by the way.
Yeah, it is a lot. There is one bill that did reach him that kind of works at the issue from the other side, rather than being kind of proactive, it's reactive. It's aimed at preventing local communities from using extraordinary methods to stop housing projects.
Right.
I mean, it's not a proactive bill, it's a kind of a reactive bill. But even that is controversial among local governments. It'll be very interesting to see whether the governor signs that bill.
So CEQA reform?
Well, CEQA reform, as Jerry Brown called the Lord's work,
That's right.
didn't even come up on the horizon this year, even though in his State of the State address, Gavin Newsom said that if we can suspend CEQA for sports arenas, we should be able to do it for housing. Did he lift a finger to do it? No.
Nothing happened. It was radio silence.
And he's finding out that it's easy to say something, it's much more difficult to deliver it. And he's kind of short on his promises so far.
Yeah. Okay. Well, up next, we're going to talk about criminal justice reform. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with longtime observers of state politics, Dan Walters of CalMatters and John Myers of the LA Times. So, Dan, what were the politics behind AB 392, the bill that changed the standard for police use of deadly force from what's reasonable to what's necessary?
I think the Sacramento cops killed one too many people, basically. And that just lit the fire when Stephon Clark got killed in his grandmother's backyard. And it had been percolating for a long time, the idea that cops are essentially immune to prosecution if they shoot somebody, because there's always this reasonable fear factor. Mm-hmm. And this kind of gelled it. This one death, even though in some ways it was less awful than some of the others, this is the one thing that really did it. And it happened right here in Sacramento, which made a big difference, I think. And it just pushed the thing over the brink, and got this new law that tightens up the definition of a justifiable homicide by police. And the cops don't like it, but they took it kind of more or less, rather than face something that was more draconian.
Well, John, I want to ask you, is the legislature just responding to the concerns of a changing voter demographic?
I think in ways. I mean, the legislature often responds to headlines. I mean, to Dan's point, and things that happen there. And I think in the end here, I don't think anyone would disagree that the new law is going to not be the end of the discussion. I mean, right? The new law basically changes that standard of use of force from what's reasonable to what's necessary. But that has to be litigated. That has to be put in a court of law. Prosecutors have to take a look at it. Juries have to take a look at it. And so even the supporters of AB 392, who wanted a more stringent standard, said, well, we know this is going to have to be tested in court. And so I think this is a conversation that could continue.
Yeah, I think so. Well, I'll ask you, John, about AB 1185. This has added a new layer of oversight on county sheriffs. Why the increased push for transparency and accountability with county sheriffs?
I mean, this particular bill has a story to it, and it's a story of a Democratic lawmaker from Sacramento who has been quarreling for quite some time with the Republican sheriff of Sacramento County. So this is Assemblyman Kevin McCarty, Democrat Assemblyman, and Scott Jones, the sheriff of Sacramento. He thinks the sheriff of Sacramento has had too little oversight, and he wanted to have some more. This bill would have allowed these new sheriff oversight agencies in counties if they wanted them. It didn't move forward. I think sheriffs may be in a different place than the rest of law enforcement. Sheriffs are pretty powerful. Sheriffs are independently elected. But it does raise this question, I think, overall about uniformity of justice, uniformity of the law, county to county. I would be surprised if we keep talking about it.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it will be something that popped up. I think in a way, not only fueled by this feud in Sacramento, but basically a partisan feud, but the scandals that have enveloped the sheriff's office in Los Angeles County, the state's most populous county. I mean, that's the biggest, I think probably the biggest police agency in California. Mm-hmm. And they've just had scandal after scandal after scandal. The former sheriff got convicted of crimes. Mm-hmm. And so it's there, and it's going to probably keep percolating along. And maybe the real thing is having an elected sheriff an anachronism left over from the pioneer days, right, that maybe it ought to be done a different way or something like that.
Even before the sheriff of Nottingham.
And let's not forget one more part of sheriffs. Sheriffs control county jails, and county jails and sheriffs have been fighting with Democrats in the legislature about immigration and the working along with ICE and federal immigration agents. It's another clash point, I think, between sheriffs and Democrats.
Also, the jails have become very overcrowded in the last few years because the state has been basically emptying out its prisons, and a lot more inmates are going to county jails rather than prisons, and that's caused all sorts of tensions as well.
Let me ask you about another bill, Dan. AB 1215, this is on facial recognition, use of facial recognition by police officers. They're saying the reason for this bill is that the technology isn't ready. What happens when it is ready?
That's a good question. It's part of the larger question of privacy and how much surveillance is too much, and the cameras on the street corners and all these kind of shot things and all these new electronic surveillance machines that will read license plates and pop up the ones that don't look good and all that. There's a whole field there of technology and law enforcement and personal rights and civil rights and all this kind of stuff and privacy that's unexplored. And it's like something we talked about the nature of employment. What is the nature of privacy in the electronic age? What's the nature of employment in the age of technology and all these kind of things? Big unanswered
Seems like the legislature is trying to catch up with the changes in society. John, let me ask you this. So what do you see regarding public safety legislation and policy going forward? What do you see on the horizon?
Well, I certainly think more of the way law enforcement does its job. And I think also an additional look, as we saw several pieces of legislation this year and in the last couple of years, on recidivism and on bringing people back into rehabilitation versus just locking them up. We've seen Democrats push issues about murder rules, about people who are accomplices to murders, right? We've seen the issues of the rights of felons and voting. I think we're going to see more of this conversation of what happens after a crime is committed and what you do with a person for the rest of their life. I think that is a far different conversation than we had a quarter of a century ago.
Okay, well, up next we're going to talk about some of the other issues that the governor and legislature were talking about this last legislative session. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking to some of our favorite observers of state politics, John Myers of the LA Times and Dan Walters of CalMatters. So, John, the vaccine debate was some crazy political theater in Sacramento this year. Is the vitriol surrounding that debate the new normal, or is this just a one-off of bad behavior?
I don't know if it's a new normal, though. I think there are people in the state capitol who wonder about the intensity of that debate, the way things happened, the protests, the yelling and screaming from the gallery of the state assembly and the state senate, and will that be allowed? And let me point out, I mean, I don't remember people being able to yell for very long before this year, and in the assembly they got to be a lot more vocal, the critics of the vaccine law. But I think at the end of the day, this one was an intersection of parental rights, public health, and social media. There are parents who believe they know best. There are people who believe this is a public health issue and certainly have a lot of data to back that up. And social media fed this like nothing else. I mean, and this was, from the protest to the person who threw what appeared to be blood from the gallery of the Senate on the last day, one of the most, not the most unusual I've seen in my couple of decades.
Pretty crazy. Dan, I want to ask you about this battle between California and the Trump administration over tailpipe emissions. It's kind of problematic, not certainly from a policy standpoint, because the state's trying to slash greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030. It just so happens that tailpipe emissions represent 40% of the state's greenhouse gas emissions, the biggest source. We've got 4 auto companies that are agreeing with California, they're going to go along with the standards. Why would a Republican fight against companies and against states' rights?
Well, states' rights is one of those things that you bring up states' rights when it's convenient to bring up states' rights. You don't bring up states' rights when it's not convenient to bring up states' rights. In this case, the idea of California trying to set itself apart, and this is not the only issue. As you know, I think California has sued the Trump administration, what, 60 times now?
Yes,
something like
so
that?
far.
So this is a whole variety of issues of California trying to set itself apart as a separate nation, kind of, a separate nation state.
Well, the
of a
flag
sort.
does say California Republic.
I know, it says California Republic. And people in Washington saying, no, you can't, and you've got to toe the line, and there's emotion and partisanship and ideology and all this stuff is mixed up. All of these battles are just basically kind of, in a way, proxy battles for the fact that California doesn't like Trump and Trump doesn't like California. And so all these things are just proxy battles for that.
And there's a good politics.
It's one-upsmanship.
Well, it's good politics on both sides, right? You're going for the base, right? The Trump base likes the fact.
Everybody's appealing to their base, right. and you have also now a governor in Gavin Newsom, somebody who obviously wants to make a name for himself. He's out, the United Nations talking about being ashamed of Donald Trump and the national government, and California showing the way and stuff like that.
And just look, I mean, precedent versus politics, the two P's here for me. I mean, politics, absolutely, but the precedent. There have been Republican and Democratic governors and Republican and Democratic presidents who have allowed California to have this waiver to work on its own emissions for a very long time. You wonder about that precedent, but then with this politics layered over it, it does seem like we're fighting a lot.
Well, let me ask you this, John. The governor, despite he's being a fierce critic of the Trump administration, everybody acknowledges that, he isn't backing SB 1, which would have, if enacted, had the state adopt the federal environmental regulations that were rolled back by Trump. The most important are dealing with water. What's up with that?
Yeah, well, I was going to say water. I mean, like, how long do we have to talk about this? I would defer to Dan. He could give us that piece. I mean, this does come down to some powerful water agencies concerned about taking these federal laws and putting them in state law, even though, and I was really struck by this, Mark, I mean, it's an insurance policy law. It's a policy that says only if the feds do something to eliminate these environmental rules, California will then take them and put them into state law. So it wasn't something that was going to happen immediately, but all of that fight over environmental issues in the Delta with water suppliers, the Endangered Species Act, all of that came to a head. Newsom picked a side on this at this point that I think has really ticked off some environmentalists.
So, yeah, you have to remember that there has been these negotiations going on for years over trying to settle California's water war. How much money's going to go, how much water is going to go through the Delta, how much is going to be kept for the farmers, and so on and so forth. And Trump's weighed in on it, say he wants more for the farmers, and so the fear was, and Dianne Feinstein weighed in against SB 1 on the side of the farmers, saying this will just blow up all these water negotiations. We'd have to go back to square zero. You can't do that. I think this was one of those cases where, yes, they've taken shots at Trump and they filed suits and they made a lot of noise and stuff like this, but this was something that was actually going to affect California. This wasn't just one of these cross-continental squabbles. Right. This was actually going to have some material effect on some very influential people and on one of the major industries. And Newsom just, in the end, didn't want to go there.
Yeah, do you think this is going to put more pressure then on to get those voluntary agreements taken care of?
I think he now is under pressure. Yes, he's under pressure to make sure that there is a water deal, and so that his veto is not in vain. Right. Otherwise, he comes out with egg on his face.
Between that and housing, he's got a lot on his agenda for the upcoming year for sure.
Nobody twisted his arm to run for governor.
There you go. Well, I want to thank our guests, Dan Walters from CalMatters and John Myers from the LA Times. Want to stay current with state and local politics? You can sign up on our website for the Maddy Daily, or just log on to our website for more information on state and local politics. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Institute. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.